Listen carefully, because what you're about to hear could change how you see the next global war. Donald Trump has just issued a warning to Iran so extreme, so direct, that even Washington insiders are quietly panicking. He didn't just talk about a nuclear deal, he threatened something far worse. And here's the part you won't see on CNN, BBC, or most US mainstream media tonight. Before I break this down completely, make sure you subscribe to this channel, like this video, and turn on the bell icon right now, because what I'm about to show you gets buried fast once people start connecting the dots. The mainstream media will show you the headline. They'll show you a single quote, but they will never explain what this warning really means, why Trump chose these exact words, and how close the world actually is to a major escalation. This is not just about Iran. This is not just about a nuclear deal. This is about power, pressure, timing, and a message meant for more than one country. Stay with me till the end, because I'm going to break down everything, step by step, the hidden signals, the political calculation, and the consequences nobody is talking about. Let's start. On January 28th, 2026, former U.S. President Donald Trump escalated tensions with Iran by issuing one of the most dramatic and direct ultimatums in recent American foreign policy history. In a public message delivered via social media and amplified across global news platforms, Trump stated bluntly that unless Tehran agrees to a new nuclear deal, one that restricts its nuclear capabilities, the next U.S. military action against Iran will be far worse than anything previously seen. This warning was not subtle diplomatic pressure. It was a stark geopolitical threat that instantly reverberated through capitals from Washington to Tehran and beyond. To fully grasp the gravity of this statement, we must understand the backdrop of decades-long U.S.-Iran tensions. The United States and Iran have had strained relations since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Over time, this tension has focused chiefly on Iran's nuclear program, a controversial issue because of global fears that Tehran might develop nuclear weapons under the guise of civilian energy enrichment. Previous attempts at international negotiation culminated in the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, a deal designed to limit Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for economic relief. Trump originally withdrew the United States from that agreement in 2018, triggering years of sanctions, retaliatory measures, and regional instability. Fast forward to January 2026. The global context is distinctly volatile. The Middle East has witnessed fluctuating crises, from Iran's internal protests and harsh crackdowns to the lingering aftermath of conflicts involving Iran-backed forces, Israel, and other regional actors. Against this backdrop, Trump's public warning was more than a diplomatic reminder. It was a declaration of renewed pressure, complete with implied military backing. He referenced a powerful U.S. naval fleet, including an aircraft carrier strike group, moving into position near Iran. This move was clearly intended as a show of force, signaling that the U.S. was prepared to escalate beyond sanctions and rhetoric if diplomatic avenues failed. Crucially, Tehran's immediate reaction was one of rejection and refusal to negotiate under threat. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araqi stated that there has been no recent request for U.S. negotiations, undercutting Trump's suggestion that Iran might be open to talks. Tehran insisted that negotiations must occur without coercion, and certainly not under the shadow of looming military threat. This highlights a fundamental diplomatic impasse. Iran views external threats as a catalyst for resistance, while the U.S. frames pressure as the only path to constrain nuclear ambitions. Beyond the immediate leader's statements, this escalation has significant strategic implications. First, it challenges the fragile balance of power in the Middle East. Countries like Turkey urge the U.S. and Iran to resolve issues incrementally rather than leap to confrontation, warning that military conflict could have catastrophic regional consequences. Ankara's call for measured diplomacy underscores broader international concern that unilateral ultimatums may spiral into open confrontation. Second, Trump's framing, far worse, attacks if no deal is signed, effectively ties nuclear diplomacy to military threat rather than traditional negotiation. That blurs the line between coercive diplomacy and pretext for war. In the complex world of nuclear nonproliferation, such an ultimatum complicates international consensus and risks undermining diplomatic channels that have historically helped curb proliferation without armed conflict. Experts worry that this could force Iran deeper into alliances with powers like Russia or China, further destabilizing global security frameworks. Finally, this threat carries powerful domestic implications for both nations. For Trump, it reinforces a narrative of strength and resolve to a political base that favors hardline approaches. For Iran, resistance to external coercion resonates with nationalist and regime-legitimizing rhetoric. In short, Trump's January 28th warning wasn't simply a policy statement. It was a geopolitical flashpoint with potential reverberations across military, diplomatic, and political arenas worldwide. In the escalating standoff between the United States and Iran, one of the most dramatic and immediate elements of the latest political tensions has been the deployment of a significant U.S. naval armada toward Iranian waters, a move publicly confirmed by former President Donald Trump himself. Trump repeatedly described this deployment as a massive armada of American naval forces heading toward Iran, signaling readiness for direct military action if Tehran refuses to negotiate a new nuclear deal. But to truly understand the strategic depth and the global implications, we must unpack what this buildup actually means beyond the media soundbite. The first question is precise. What is this armada? At its core, the phrase refers to a U.S. aircraft carrier strike group, anchored around the USS Abraham Lincoln, CVN-72, and a squadron of powerful naval warships and destroyers that have moved into the U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, area of responsibility, including parts of the Arabian Sea and the broader Middle East waters. These vessels are equipped with sophisticated offensive and defensive systems, including Tomahawk cruise missiles, advanced anti-air capabilities, and fighter aircraft that can launch strikes deep into foreign territory from sea. One of the first things to note is that carrier strike groups like the USS Abraham Lincoln are not casually deployed. They serve as floating symbols of American military might, and their movement is always a message. According to Reuters and multiple international media reports, Trump himself said the fleet was heading in that direction as a show of strength, intended to either deter Iran from continuing its nuclear program and internal repression, or to force Tehran back to the negotiating table. Trump's language here was precise. At public events and during speeches, he referred to additional vessels as a beautiful armada floating beautifully toward Iran, and expressed the hope that Iran will make a deal before this force needs to be used. This rhetorical framing serves two strategic purposes. First, it sends a message of resolve to the Iranian leadership. Second, it attempts to reassure U.S. domestic audiences that the deployment is cautious and not necessarily intended for war. But the reality at sea and in diplomatic capitals is far more serious than rhetoric might suggest. The presence of multiple destroyers, aircraft carriers, and potentially even submarines significantly expands the U.S. capacity to conduct missile strikes, enforce no-fly zones, or impose severe military pressure with little warning. Historical precedent shows that U.S. carrier strike groups are central to force projection. They played key roles in past conflicts such as the Gulf War, Iraq War, and operations against ISIS. The implied message to Tehran and Tehran's allies is clear. The U.S. has the capability to follow through if diplomacy fails. Iran's reaction to this naval buildup has been unequivocal. Senior Iranian officials have warned that any form of military action, even a limited strike, would be considered an act of all-out war against the Islamic Republic. That kind of rhetoric is not mere bluster. It reflects Tehran's doctrine of deterrence, which has historically emphasized that foreign military pressure must be met with proportionate defense, potentially involving missile attacks on U.S. interests in the region or on allied states. Another critical dimension lies in the regional political dynamics. Gulf nations, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, have expressed reluctance to allow their territories or airspace to be used in a direct strike against Iran, complicating the operational calculus of any potential U.S. military engagement. This resistance underscores a complex strategic landscape where allies may not be willing to fully support direct action, even against Iran. Ultimately, Trump's assertion of a massive armada heading toward Iran is more than a militaristic soundbite. It reveals a multi-layered political and strategic gambit. The deployment serves as a deterrent force aimed at preventing further Iranian nuclear escalation, a bargaining chip to compel Iran to negotiate a geopolitical signal to both allies and adversaries about U.S. global reach, a domestic political tool that reinforces Trump's image as tough on foreign threats. All of these factors combine to make this naval deployment one of the most consequential military postures in recent U.S.-Iran relations. It's not just about ships sailing in a strategic theater. It's about the interplay of diplomacy, threat, and power in one of the world's most volatile geopolitical fault lines. In the complex geopolitical chessboard of early 2026, the latest U.S. ultimatum to Iran that its next military action will be far worse if Tehran won't agree to a new nuclear deal didn't emerge in isolation. This escalation unfolded against a much broader backdrop of regional instability, deep internal unrest in Iran and a rapidly evolving diplomatic reaction from global powers. To truly understand the significance of Trump's announcement, we must explore these broader tensions that are now reshaping not only the Middle East, but also international strategic alignments. Pushpin, this is not just a bilateral threat. It is a regional and global flashpoint with far-reaching consequences. First, let's examine the internal unrest inside Iran itself, which has reached one of the most critical junctures in years. Beginning in late December 2025, widespread protests erupted across major Iranian cities due to spiraling economic hardship and political frustration. These protests spread to all 31 provinces, driven by soaring inflation, skyrocketing living costs, and unprecedented currency collapse. Factors that pushed ordinary Iranians into the streets demanding reforms and accountability from the clerical leadership. The severity of these demonstrations has been staggering. Independent monitoring groups and human rights organizations report significant casualties and arrests, reflecting a brutal government crackdown aimed at suppressing dissent. At the same time, Iranian authorities employed a near-total internet and communication blackout to limit information flow, both domestic and international, thereby masking the true scale of unrest and civilian suffering. This brutal domestic environment becomes especially significant when viewed alongside Trump's military threats, because Iran's government is now not only dealing with external pressure, but also trying to contain an explosive internal crisis that directly challenges its legitimacy. This combination represents a dual-front stress scenario: rising civilian dissent at home and mounting pressure from powerful foreign adversaries abroad. But Iran is not just reacting. It is also shaping the narrative of how the world interprets its internal struggles. Tehran has vigorously denied requests for direct negotiations with the United States, explicitly rejecting diplomatic talks in an atmosphere of threats and coercion. Iran's foreign minister stated that there had been no recent request for negotiations, contradicting American claims and highlighting the diplomatic divide. This refusal underscores a broader Iranian strategy, portraying the regime as a defender of sovereignty under siege, rather than a failing government capitulating to external demands. This Iranian narrative is designed to rally domestic support and clamp down on dissent by framing internal unrest as part of a larger foreign conspiracy. Adding to the regional dimension, neighboring and global actors are reacting with caution and concern. For example, Turkey has publicly urged the U.S. to address disputes with Iran through incremental steps instead of overarching ultimatums, warning that a confrontational approach could backfire and further destabilize the region. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have also signaled resistance to any direct military confrontation by restricting their airspace against such action and calling for dialogue instead of conflict. These diplomatic responses demonstrate a growing regional desire to avoid full-scale military conflict, recognizing that any confrontation between the United States and Iran could quickly engulf the broader Middle East. Whether bound by trade, religious ties, or geopolitical balance, countries in the Gulf are navigating a delicate path between opposing escalation and preserving stability. At the same time, global powers like the European Union and the Group of Seven, G7, have expressed concerns over the internal crackdowns and called for restraint, with indications that additional sanctions could be considered if violence continues. These reactions reflect a diplomatic front where the U.S. and its allies are trying to balance pressure on Iran while avoiding outright war. In summary, Trump's announcement, warning of a far worse military action, is not just a solitary headline. It is deeply embedded within a web of internal turmoil, diplomatic caution, and regional anxiety. The internal protests in Iran, driven by economic collapse and political dissatisfaction, have weakened Tehran's position domestically. The regime's aggressive suppression and communication blackout signal desperation. At the same time, regional states and global powers are approaching the crisis with diplomatic nuance rather than outright support for escalation. This convergence of domestic instability, military posturing, and international diplomacy reveals a Middle East at a critical inflection point, where decisions made in Tehran, Riyadh, Ankara, Washington, and Brussels could change the course of history. On January 28th, 2026, as tensions between the United States and Iran soared to levels not seen in years, one of Tehran's most forceful diplomatic responses came not through military movement, but through words from its leadership. A blunt assertion that Iran has not requested negotiations with Washington and categorically rejects any talks under coercive threats. This statement didn't just push back. It reshaped the narrative of the U.S. Iran standoff and exposed a deeper ideological fault line in international diplomacy. Fire what Iran actually said, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araqi addressed state media and international reporters, emphasizing that there has been no recent contact between him and U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. Iran has not made any request for negotiations with the United States. Indirect intermediaries are consulting, but that is not the same as formal U.S. Iran talks. Most importantly, Tehran insists that negotiations cannot happen in an atmosphere of threats and coercion. This is a crucial diplomatic stance. By clarifying that there were no negotiation requests from Iran's side, Tehran signaled that it sees Trump's public claims about Iran wanting talks as misleading or strategic rhetoric rather than factual reality. At first glance, this might sound like a routine diplomatic denial, but in the context of rising military threats and a U.S. naval armada heading toward the Persian Gulf, the implications are far more profound. Here's why. President Trump has publicly stated that he hopes Iran will come to negotiate a new nuclear deal before further military action becomes necessary. But Iran's official denial challenges that narrative. Tehran is essentially saying, we weren't the ones requesting talks, and we will not negotiate when the other party presses guns and warships against us. This flips the script from diplomacy to coercive power. Iran's leaders made it clear negotiations can only proceed if threats and excessive demands are set aside. In diplomatic language, that means threats of bombings, sanctions, or forced ultimatums do not qualify as a basis for genuine negotiation. Talks must be grounded in mutual respect and equal footing, not intimidation. This stance appeals to legal and moral principles in international relations. You cannot build lasting agreements under the shadow of guns. By drawing a line in the sand about conditions for diplomacy, Iran is rejecting what it calls coercive diplomacy, positioning itself as open to dialogue, but only under terms that respect sovereignty and dignity, communicating to global audiences that its resistance isn't irrational, it's principled. This narrative shift is powerful because it reframes Iran's diplomatic posture from isolationist stubbornness to a stance of conditional engagement rooted in international norms. Contrary to portrayals of Tehran as a pariah state, Iran's statement reveals ongoing indirect diplomatic consultation through intermediaries' communication channels that remain active with foreign states, a willingness to explore negotiations in a way that's not driven by military threats. In other words, Iran isn't closing the door on diplomacy. It's demanding that door be opened under real negotiation terms, not under the threat of bombs. The U.S. now faces a choice: continue to escalate threats and risk pushing Iran further into defensive or military postures, change its diplomatic approach to one that meets Iran's minimum criteria for real talks. Either choice will shape the next phase of this crisis, and neither offers a quick or easy resolution. Iran's rejection of talks under threat indirectly challenges not just U.S. policy, but the reliability of U.S. diplomatic outreach. If Iran believes U.S. demands are coercive, then Tehran sees them as tools of intimidation rather than pathways to peace. That perception, accurate or not, will heavily influence the next moves in this volatile standoff. Iran's public statement that it has not requested negotiations and rejects coercive threats is not just a denial. It is a strategic diplomatic maneuver that reframes the entire U.S. Iran confrontation. It undercuts U.S. messaging, elevates Tehran's moral position, and forces world powers to reckon with what real diplomacy must look like. As tensions between the United States and Iran continue to escalate, one of the most important, yet often underreported, developments is the growing call from regional powers for restraint, diplomacy, and de-escalation. Among these voices, Turkey has emerged as a key actor urging measured diplomacy over military confrontation, highlighting a widening gap between Washington's pressure-based strategy and the regional desire to avoid another catastrophic conflict in the Middle East. Turkey's position is significant not because it is neutral, but because it sits at the intersection of East and West, NATO and the Muslim world, diplomacy and security. When Ankara speaks, both sides listen, and right now, Turkey is sending a clear message. Escalation will destabilize the entire region, not just Iran and the United States. Turkish officials have publicly called on Washington to address disputes with Iran step by step, rather than through sweeping ultimatums and military threats. This phrasing is critical. It reflects a diplomatic philosophy rooted in incremental confidence building, rather than shock and awe pressure. From Turkey's perspective, sudden military action or aggressive posturing risks triggering chain reactions, retaliation, proxy conflicts, energy disruptions, and refugee flows that no regional power is prepared to absorb. Why is Turkey so concerned? Because it has firsthand experience with the consequences of Middle Eastern wars. Conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Libya have already strained Turkey's economy, border security, and social cohesion. Another large-scale confrontation involving Iran would likely disrupt regional trade routes, destabilize energy markets, increase refugee movements toward Turkish borders, expand proxy conflicts involving militias and non-state actors. In short, Turkey understands that wars in the Middle East never stay contained. More importantly, Ankara's diplomatic appeal exposes a growing disconnect between U.S. strategy and regional priorities. While Washington frames military pressure as leverage, regional actors view it as a destabilizing force that reduces room for diplomacy. Turkey has emphasized that Iran has signaled openness to nuclear talks, but only if they occur without threats. From Ankara's viewpoint, ignoring that condition risks closing the door to diplomacy altogether. Turkey is not alone in this stance. Other regional states, including Gulf countries, have quietly echoed similar concerns. While they may not openly oppose the United States, many have shown reluctance to support direct military action against Iran. This hesitation reflects a broader regional calculation. The cost of war would be paid locally, not in Washington. Another key reason Turkey's call matters is its NATO membership. As a NATO ally, Turkey's push for restraint challenges the assumption that Western military alignment automatically translates into support for escalation. Ankara's position suggests that even within Western alliances, there is no consensus that military confrontation with Iran is the right path forward. From a diplomatic perspective, Turkey is attempting to position itself as a potential mediator, or at least a stabilizing influence. By urging both sides to de-escalate, Ankara keeps communication channels open and preserves its relevance in future negotiations. This is a classic middle power strategy. Avoid taking sides militarily while shaping outcomes diplomatically. However, Turkey's message also carries an implicit warning to Washington. If the United States ignores regional voices and pursues unilateral escalation, it risks losing regional cooperation, weakening diplomatic legitimacy. Forcing allies into passive resistance rather than active support, that kind of fragmentation would severely complicate any long-term strategy toward Iran. For Iran, Turkey's stance offers diplomatic breathing room. It reinforces Tehran's argument that negotiations under threat are illegitimate and that regional actors prefer dialogue over force. This external validation strengthens Iran's bargaining position, even as it faces internal unrest and international pressure. In essence, Turkey's call for measured diplomacy reveals a critical truth. The Middle East does not want another war. While global powers debate leverage and deterrence, regional actors are focused on stability, survival, and spillover effects. Their priority is not dominance, it is damage control. This moment, therefore, is not just about U.S.-Iran relations. It is about whether global powers will listen to regional realities or override them in pursuit of strategic pressure. Turkey's intervention underscores that diplomacy is still possible, but only if escalation does not drown it out. As the standoff between the United States and Iran intensifies, one of the most telling developments is not coming from Washington or Tehran alone. It is emerging from the rest of the world. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, governments and international institutions are expressing growing concern that this confrontation could spiral into a wider conflict. What began as a warning about a nuclear deal is now widely viewed as a potential flashpoint with global consequences. International concern is rooted in a simple reality. Escalation between the U.S. and Iran never stays local. History has repeatedly shown that even limited confrontations in the Middle East can quickly expand into regional instability, economic disruption, and long-term geopolitical fallout. This is why diplomats, analysts, and global leaders are increasingly warning that the current trajectory carries serious conflict risk. One major source of concern is the language being used. Trump's warning that the next U.S. attack would be far worse, combined with visible military movements, has raised alarms among allies who fear that rhetoric is outpacing diplomacy. In international relations, words matter, especially when they are backed by military capability. Many governments worry that such language narrows the space for compromise and increases the likelihood of miscalculation. European leaders, in particular, have emphasized the danger of escalation. Countries that were directly involved in the original Iran nuclear deal have repeatedly warned that threat-based diplomacy undermines non-proliferation efforts. From their perspective, pressure without a clear diplomatic off-ramp risks pushing Iran toward more aggressive postures rather than compliance. This concern is not ideological. It is pragmatic. Europe sits close enough to the Middle East to feel the immediate effects of instability, from refugee flows to energy price shocks. Another layer of global anxiety comes from economic vulnerability. Any military confrontation involving Iran would immediately threaten key shipping lanes, including the Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply passes. Even the perception of risk can drive up energy prices, destabilize markets, and slow global growth. For countries already facing economic uncertainty, this is an unacceptable gamble. Asian powers are also watching closely. Nations dependent on Middle Eastern energy supplies, including China, India, Japan, and South Korea, are deeply concerned that escalation could disrupt trade and energy security. While some of these countries may not speak loudly in public, their diplomatic signals suggest a clear preference for de-escalation and negotiated solutions. At the United Nations, the mood has grown increasingly tense. Calls for restraint and dialogue reflect a broader fear that the international system is losing its ability to manage crises peacefully. When major powers rely on threats rather than frameworks, smaller states begin to doubt whether international norms still provide protection. This erosion of confidence has long-term implications far beyond the U.S.-Iran relationship. Another critical concern is the risk of unintended escalation. Military assets operating in close proximity increase the chance of accidents, misinterpretations, or isolated incidents that could rapidly spiral out of control. History is filled with examples where conflicts began not through deliberate decisions, but through misunderstandings amplified by political pressure. There is also the question of proxy involvement. Iran's regional influence extends through various allied groups across the Middle East. Many international observers fear that a direct U.S.-Iran clash would quickly expand into multiple fronts, drawing in additional actors and making containment nearly impossible. This scenario would transform a bilateral standoff into a regional crisis with global repercussions. For the international community, the central fear is not just war, it is loss of control. Once escalation begins, leaders often find themselves reacting rather than steering events. That loss of strategic control is what keeps diplomats awake at night. In essence, global concern reflects a collective understanding that the current moment is fragile. The combination of harsh rhetoric, military signaling, internal pressures within Iran, and unresolved diplomatic frameworks has created a volatile mix. International actors are not simply worried about what the U.S. and Iran intend to do. They are worried about what might happen despite intentions. This is why calls for restraint are growing louder. The world is signaling that it recognizes the stakes. Escalation here would not be contained, not predictable, and not easily reversed. The risk is not just conflict. It is a chain reaction that could reshape regional and global stability for years to come. As the world watches this situation unfold, one thing is clear: this is not just another headline. What happens next could reshape global security, diplomacy, and the balance of power in the Middle East. That's why staying informed matters more than ever. If you found this breakdown valuable, support the channel by liking this video, subscribe for more deep, no-nonsense analysis, and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next, because these stories move fast and the truth often gets buried. We'll keep breaking down what others won't explain. Stay alert, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next update.